on the screen.
Yes.
Yes.
And where's Peter? Okay, Peter Berman is down here. And
Yes.
can you, right.
Hmm?
So,
I'm here.
yes,
What do
we're
I do?
not quite beginning yet. We don't have an Italian audience really, except for the four of us. Welcome, Peter. And,
Thank you. Lovely to see you.
Yes, and do you know that right opposite the door of the Arte di Beccai, which is the headquarters for the Accademia delle Arti del Disegno, is Donatello's statue of St. George.
Yeah.
Really?
It's
Oh, wonderful.
absolutely perfect for us because you, Peter, and Arjun Jain and myself, we're all companions of the Guild of St. George.
Yes.
So it's perfect.
Wonderful.
Wonderful.
Yes.
Well, I'm so pleased to see you all.
Right.
It's,
And I think
it's
going
rather
to be-
early for me.
All
on
right.
Saturday morning.
Yes. And we're waiting until we get more of an audience, but the papers are wonderful and they're already published on, the proceedings with the web can be very flexible. We can keep a proofreading and making them better than, and Sriran in India, there are elections going on and he's a doctor, a medical student. So he's been called to work. So I'll be using his slide share and reading his paper.
Can I send my text later? Julia?
And this is Amina Aneli, and she is responsible for having restored the tomb of the monument of the Indian prince. And she has been helping me enormously with organizing who will be coming to the lunch and the dinner. And right. So initially, everything begins at least 15 minutes after the stated time.
Yes.
And I have a question. Would it be better if I gave my presentation in English rather than in Italian? It is in Italian on the web.
Si può inviare almeno qui in sala, perché se io accendo l'impianto vocale si sente il tutto alto. Sì, sì, è per sentire qui. Vado a cercare le case. Prova? Sì, certo, scusa. Alle... Sì. No, ora dopo.
Ok,
Proviamo l'audio, se funziona, se no cambio le casse.
ok, sì, proviamo e c'è bisogno anche di avere questo per
Sì,
slide sharing.
sì, sì.
Ok, penso come arrivare, no,
Sì?
c'è anche, se è già lì su
Sì,
desktop,
aspetta.
come arrivare, ok, bene,
Admit e poi...
Nicholas, bene, sì.
Allora, dunque, aspetti,
Share
Sì, sì, sì.
screen,
Allora, un secondo. Allora.
è su desktop, ma non è...
E
ok.
questo va un po'. Dunque, perché bisogna condividere lo schermo, però volevo vedere il desktop prima. Ecco. Vediamo se ci fa. Non ci fa muovere questa. Infatti, lo so perché sta registrando. Allora.
Hello.
Sì, buongiorno.
Hello. Buongiorno.
Is it possible to do share screen on?
Sì, sì, allora.
Mhm.
Però,
Okay.
ok.
Hello, Nicholas.
Via.
Hello.
Buongiorno. Buongiorno.
Hi, buongiorno.
Buongiorno.
No. No.
Forse se we
No,
stop
no,
recording.
share qui. No, 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 no. No,
Okay.
if you stop. Allora, share. No.
You see,
Allora.
because it's not reduced down to the.
Yeah. Oh.
Right.
And in this moment, we have to do this. F5. Yeah. Share screen. Questo F5. If you want to show at the on translation full screen, I don't know how to show full screen.
Oh, don't worry. I think we can just do it that way. It should be slideshow.
Slideshow, yeah.
Mhm. And then
Beginning from beginning. Yeah.
Okay. Allora,
Yes.
right.
Forse.
I think we need to restart recording.
Yeah. You are recording.
Okay.
Yeah. Allora ci sei?
Iniziamo. Perché la maggioranza sul web sono inglesi, Parleremo in inglese, però tutte le cose sono disponibili su vostri telefonini in italiano, se desidera averlo. Questa conferenza oggi è su Firenze e India e noi dedichiamo, mi scusi questo, dedichiamo questa conferenza non solo a Giorgio Lapira e Fioretta Mazzei, as in the past with our previous 9 city and book conferences, but also to the memories of Maurizio Bossi of the Gabinetto Vieux and the Accademia delle Arti del Disegno, the Marchese Gabriel Venturi Ginorindici e Bourbon, and the Marchese Vieri Torrigiani Malaspina, che ha fatto tante cose per il nostro giardino nel cimitero. May their names be a blessing to us and to these proceedings. We are most grateful to the Comune of Florence who restored the Indian prince's tomb, and to the Elders Accademia, the Accademia de Belle Arti del Disegno, and her president, Cristina Accidini, for housing this conference. To the Museo Stibat for showing us its imperial loot collected together here in Florence, to the Trollope Society, and to John Ruskin's Guild of St. George, where I met fellow companion via Zoom, Arjun Shivaji Jain of Delhi and his Red House, modeled on the principles of John Ruskin, William Morris, Mahatma Gandhi, and Lev Tolstoy, who is our co-organizer. And that is the image here. No, I've got it here, right. And he's modeled on these principles, who is our co-organizer. Instead of forcing India to pay tribute to us, we here pay tribute to India and her ancient civilization, while apologizing for British upstart imperialism that did so much harm to India, to Ireland, and to the Americas, with its practices of English landlords, rack renting Irish tenants, the enslavement of Africans in the New World, and the bloodshed and famine of the Indian subcontinent. My father had spent the 30s in India, was Gandhi's biographer and friend, and covered the salt march to Dandi for the Times of India, of which he was an editor. Besides the tragedy of Gandhi, and which he wrote when Gandhi was in prison, he also wrote Peasant and Prince. As a small child, I was jokingly betrothed to a Raja staying with us in Sussex, and I treasured the hand-carved ball and cup he gave us. India's independence was declared when I was 8, and I was glued to the radio listening to Nehru and Mountbatten, and would rush in tears to my parents whenever I read in the newspapers about Gandhi's fast. But I never visited India. To me, it was both this exotic fairy tale place, all Edward Said's Orientalism, but also the tragedy of its terrible partitioning between Hindu and Muslim. The nuns of my convent school and taught in Nainital's Anglican All Saints College for girls. My mother found us sending them to India by way of Florence, where they brought large albums of Alinari and Brogi photographs in order to teach Florentine art. Albums I now have. And many of our schoolgirls were born in India, speaking her languages. Dame Joanna Lumley also went to my school, who always fiercely defends the Gurkhas, who were always loyal to the British, who then were willing to abandon them to statelessness. As a teenager, I read Santa Rama Rao's Home to India about her life as a teenager, following on English education, returning to her homeland, and finding the glamour of India's independence of her parents' khadi cloth wearing, now tarnished, but meeting with Rabindranath Tagore in his ashram in Kashmir, listening to the cloth producers' songs, which they used to find the patterns that they were weaving, and finding school children far more vivacious in their writing in Bengali than in stilted imperial English. Her title inverts H.M. Foster's Home to India. He also the author of A Room with a View about Florence. Then I met on Zoom a fellow, a fellow companion of John Ruskin's Guild of St. George, Arjun Shivaji Jain, whose name Shivaji celebrates our Indian prince's 17th century ancestor, who had successfully resisted both Muslim Mughals and the Christian English. First in this conference, we are celebrating the restoration of Raja Rama Chakravarti, the Maharaja of Kolhapur's Victorian tomb at the confluence of the Arno and the Mugnone in Florence's Cascine. Shelley had written about the Cascine in his Ode to the West Wind. The Maharaja was the first reigning Hindu prince to visit England and Europe after essentially being raised under house arrest and very tight control by the British. We shall visit the monument, leaving here at noon for lunch, then return to continue the conference at 2:30 p.m. Yesterday, we visited the Stibert Museum, filled with imperial loot, his family's wealth gained in India, and also the Swiss-owned so-called English cemetery, with its many links to India. Reading the young prince's diary, I feel enormous sadness. He is so compliant to his military British handlers that I sense he succumbs to his mortal illness as his only freedom from them. 30th of November, 1870. The East India Company are forbidding princes to adopt or proclaim heirs in order to seize Indian princedoms for itself. Their control of India by means of private armies was transferred to the British government in 1858, following the Indian Mutiny. This is how they lived before the Indian Mutiny. They were able to go native, but not afterwards. And then the company was dissolved in 1874. We have buried with us a relative of John Hersey Bennett, John Bennett Hersey, with the same name in our cemetery. And then we had the famine. This is the Indian Mutiny, and the Rani Lakshmi Bai. First, she was supporting the British, but they betrayed her. And then she fought against them for Indian independence, was wounded and killed. She fought with her child on her back with a sword. And the children were raised again by the British under their control, but she was killed. And then we had, this is the Indian Mutiny, where they placed the Indians in front of the cannons and blew them to pieces to punish them, and required the Emperor of India, the Mughal Emperor, to be imprisoned in Burma. And this is the famine that took place under Lord Lytton's viceregalship. And then following that, there was the Amritsar massacre of the civilians, and then the partition, where so many were having to 14 million persons displaced as refugees from their own countries, and several million dead and massacred from the hardships of travel. Italy's Risorgimento united her. India's independence divided her. The English cemetery, these are the kinds of jewels that ended up in the British Royal Collection from India, this from the Maharaja Sher Singh and so forth. The English cemetery, the Museo Stibert, and the Prince's Tomb mirror reflect that Victorian history of India, her military, medical, and civil service there, then finding retirement here in a warmer climate than England's. I use service sarcastically, much in the way Prince Harry has come to perceive his own military service, that it is more about being imperialistically murderous and self-serving than it was of partnering equally with India or Iraq. For the purposes of this conference, we speak of undivided India before its tragic partition. This is the study of a conquered subcontinent, of a profoundly ancient civilization that parented our Indo-European languages, numeracy, and culture. In our English cemetery in Florence, we find 42 military, medical, and legal professionals profiteering from India, sometimes with their wives and children present, next retiring to Florence. I shall here discuss some of them, having yesterday participated in the guided tour of all of them, following the visit to Musea Stibet. The first, Sector A in the cemetery, has the tombs of Christopher Webb Smith of the Bengal Civil Service and his wife, 1862, who were largely responsible for the building of the Gothic Holy Trinity Church in Via La Marmora. Okay.
No, sorry. 1 moment.
Right, that? Okay.
No. Sorry.
Okay, right. The Holy Trinity Church on Via La Marmora, decorated by the pre-Raphaelite John Spencer Stanford. As well, we have the tomb of, now it's not advancing. Okay. Can you help me with getting it to advance? Okay, now we've got it. Right, welcome. And as well, we have the tomb of Walter Savage Landor, while his Swiss wife, who hated him, is portrayed in the life-size statue, her back turned on him, on their son's tomb in Sector F. For Walter had been in love with Rose Aylmer, an earl's daughter, who had gone out to India and died there of cholera after 2 years. Her tomb in the Park Street Cemetery in Kolkata, with his poem to her added to it in 1910. BACSA, the British Association of Cemeteries in South Asia, tells me, and we've got the plaque on the tomb. That's the first one describing her. She was only 20. She'd left for India at 18. And this is a poem. Ah, what avails the sceptred race? Ah, what the form divine? What every virtue, every grace, Rose Aylmer, all were thine. Rose Aylmer, whom these wakeful eyes may weep but never see, a night of memories and sighs I consecrate to thee. A slightly different wording in the two versions. It used to be said that Englishmen died in India after 2 monsoons. Charles Dickens said he based his character of, I'm sorry, I've got, of Lawrence Boythorn in Bleak House on Walter Savage Landor. Buried now in the same Kolkata cemetery is also Charles Dickens' son, Walter Savage Landor's godson, whom his father named Walter Savage Landor Dickens. Then he shipped him off to India at 16 in 1857 to serve in the Indian Army, who died there in debt in 1864, never returning home. Another Dickens child, Francis Jeffrey, also went out to India in 1863 to serve in the Bengal Lancers, then to Canada. And then next we have the tomb sacred to the memory of John Bennett Hersey, captain in His Majesty's Indian Army, died at his villa Pian de Giuliari near Florence, 19th of April, 1873, whose family was deeply involved with the East India Company, frequently intermarried with Indian royalty, and he may have been present at the Indian Mutiny in Meerut. It was his relative, General John Hersey, who initiated the 1857 Indian Mutiny, punishing the revolt over the use of Enfield rifle bullets daubed with pig and cow fat, abhorrent to Muslim and Hindu alike, which would end the East India Company, the British government then taking over India, and Benjamin Disraeli proclaiming Queen Victoria its empress. The husband of Sarah Elizabeth Gough, the second Viscount Gough, okay, that was the tomb, these are more of one, served in Madras and is related by marriage to the noble Florentine Capone family. Her tomb was the first one restored by our Roma, Daniel Claudio Dumitrescu, whose ancestors brought their skills from India to Europe 1,000 years ago. The Banks family were Anglo-Indians from Calcutta, their tombs being in Sector A and F, and we'll skip over some of them, while the former but now exhumed tombs of the father Thomas and sister Amina of Colonel Thomas Tibet were in our cemetery's large slot in A107, and the Tibet family are related to the Pandolfini of Florence. In the next sector, B, are buried the Grenville Temple, whose relative Richard Temple Grenville was in Madras, and beside him is the child Isabella Temple Bailey, whose father served in the Bengal Cavalry. My father did his military service in the Bombay Light Horse, owning the polo pony, Blue Nose, which had won the largest cup in India. B24 is Mary Kidd de Dornberg, whose father was Lieutenant Alexander Kidd of the Bengal Engineers and was related to Lieutenant General Robert Kidd, who founded the Botanical Gardens in Kolkata and introduced tea plants from China to India. Wikipedia says Robert Kidd made a request in his will that he be buried without any religious ceremony. He left behind specific payments to be made to his native servants, Rajamahi Misa, in retribution for the unsuitable education given to him, entailing separation from his native soil and kindred. To the other native known by the name of George, in reparation of the injury done him by his former master, in alienating him from his tribe, understood Rajput, converting him to Christianity, and secluding him from all future connections with his family, the monthly sum of 6 rupees during his life, to both on condition of their continuing to serve Major Alexander Quid during his residence in India. And then we have Theodosia Garrett Trollope and Isa Blagden, who were fictionalized by Nathaniel Hawthorne in The Marble Faun, in their composite Miriam, who wonders, is she East Indian? Is she Jewish? Is she something else? Florence was a more welcoming place for mixed-race persons than was snobby England. Isa, friend to Henry James, friend to the Brownings, friend to many, earned her keep by writing novels and boarding guests at Bellesguardo. And this is the view from Bellesguardo. She and the poet Robert Lytton fell in love, she saving his life at Bagni di Lucca, the Brownings hoping they would marry. Robert, with the pen name Owen Meredith, wrote a poem titled Lucille about her, and she wrote a novel, Agnes Tremorne, about him. He married another and was appointed by Queen Victoria and her Jewish Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli as Viceroy of India, and presided over the devastating 1876-1878 famine in India, worse even than that in Ireland. Someone should write this Victorian love story, including its terrible context. Then we have Sir Thomas Sylvestre, and who with Raffles visited Napoleon on St. Helena, who was an old Indian army surgeon called on the baths of Lucca to attend a dying duelist. And also Major Francis Charles Gregory, whose father served in the East India Company and who himself fought at Waterloo and is one of the cemetery's Swedenborgian spiritualists. Joseph Garrow, the son of an East India Company civil servant, married to an Indian princess. Orphaned, he was raised by his father's sister, became a JP, a judge in Devon, and was the first translator of Dante's Vita Nova into English. The Times Literary Supplement remarked that it is a curious footnote to the literary annals of Anglo-India, which proves that the son of an Indian mother lived to translate Dante and to move in a circle where the Brownings and Landor were the greatest lights. Sector D has the granddaughter of Clive of India, Charlotte Mary Florentia Windsor Clive. And Sir James Annesley, late president of the medical establishment, Honorable East India Company Medical Board of Madras, wrote an enormous book on the diseases of India and warm climates generally, 1841. The Irish lawyer, Henry Johnson, son-in-law of James Dennis and husband of Anne Dennis Johnson, buries the father here in Florence, noting on the obelisk that his wife instead died and is buried in Meerut, where her tomb, Baxter says, is still in the Cantonment Cemetery. Sector P has Sir William Henry Sewell, son of King William IV, who served in India, Commander-in-Chief of the Madras Army and at Waterloo. Equally with his tomb with his wife, Georgina Sewell, and servant John James Bansfield, and a lovely biblical inscription on James Bansfield's tomb: more than a servant, a friend, more than a friend, a brother. And then we also have Julia Woodburn Strachey, who now lacks a tomb but was in this sector, married her husband in Kolkata, and is related to Lytton Strachey, who was named after Robert Lytton, first Viceroy of India. And then Sector F has Elizabeth de Bourney, whose son, Sir Henry Charles Barnston de Bourney, served in many military campaigns. And I think at this point, we need to finish up by talking a bit about Cecilia de Bourbel, whose daughter became one of the leading theosophists and spent much time in India, and also worked for the education of Indian women, as also was the case with the Maharaja Rajaram Chhatrapati of Kalhar. Thus we see 42 military, medical and legal professionals profiteering from India, sometimes with their wives and children, next to retiring to Florence and buried here. And at this point, I needed to say, and I have a problem. My printer broke down, and I needed to print out the essay by Sriram. It's very beautiful. It's on Ruskin and so forth. That is James Annesley. This is the senator for Dennis in Meerut, and this is the Maharaja. This is the bibliography I put together. Sriram wrote a splendid paper, which is published on the web, about the magic spell of the book. And he's describing how when you're reading the Bhagavad Gita, at some point it clicks, it makes sense, it comes to your heart. It's not just an intellectual reading, but much more profound. And he was saying that this had happened to other people, that Ruskin had discovered Roger's writing his poem on Italy, especially about Florence. All the fairest cities of the earth, none is so fair as Florence. 'Tis a gem of purest ray, and what a light broke forth when it emerged from the darkness. And we have Turner's illustrations to Roger's poem, seen by Ruskin, which in turn influences Ruskin's love for Italy. And then we also have, in 1904, Mohandas Gandhi, seated on a train in South Africa. A friend hands him a book to read on the journey. Gandhi later wrote, "I determined to change my life in accordance with the ideal of the book." The book was Unto This Last by Ruskin. Gandhi called him Great Ruskin. The book, gripped me, brought about an instantaneous and practical transformation in my life. Gandhi named Srimad Rajchandra Tolstoy and Ruskin as the three moderns who left a deep impression on his life and captivated him. And then CBXam describes how as a child, there was a peanut seller with a flowing beard, wore a Kosovarovka. He could very well pass for Tolstoy. He had such kindness and resolve in his face, even at that old age, or especially because of that. The same kindness and resolve that CBXam saw later in the sagely portrait of Ruskin by Collingwood. Never once was he disappointed by the quality of the peanuts that he used to sell. Similarly, never once was he disappointed by a book from Tolstoy. In his twilight years, instead of second childishness and mere oblivion, if he could emulate the grit, resolve, and determination of these old men, the peanut seller, Tolstoy, and Gandhi, then he would consider himself lucky. And this I love, this not being caste conscious or class conscious, but seeing the nobility of people who are at the bottom of society. And then he talks about Tolstoy and Gandhi. It is interesting that just as he discovered the correspondence between Tolstoy and Gandhi after reading War and Peace, he came across the correspondence between Romain Rolland and Gandhi after he read Jean Christophe. He wondered how this man had the time to read so much while also being actively involved in the nation's issues. Not to mention, he was also a prolific writer himself. His published works go into nearly 100 volumes. It is like what Einstein said of him, generations to come, it may well be, will scarce believe that such a man as this one ever in flesh and blood walked upon this earth. In 1899, Marcel Proust writes a letter to his mother, asking her to send him urgently Robert de la Cézanne's Ruskin et la religion de la beauté. Proust was staying at the time in the spa town of Evian-les-Bains on the south side of Lake Geneva. He wanted the book so that he could see the mountains through the eyes of that great man, Ruskin. And Nicholas Mander will be talking about Ruskin and mountains. Later, Proust went to the Bibliothèque Nationale and started looking up works by Ruskin. He shelved his novel, Argent Sauteur, which had remained unfinished and unpublished in his lifetime, and began working on the translation and commentary of Ruskin's works. And this is what I love. Beyond age, language, nationality, culture, and all such differences that lie like a gulf in between, there comes a point where you're connected directly to the writer of the book. The thoughts that have been floating formless in your mind get a shape, and the fleeting ideas and sensations you once had, and what remains now, vague remembrance, get cemented in the pages for posterity. All that you have to say, but never found the right words to do so, are succinctly put together by the moment you put your join hands and climb the hills with the writer to see the glorious and fantastical expanse of your mind. He leads you through the attic that is your brain and shows you things that you'd thought existed. Old, long forgotten drawers are open, intentionally suppressed, let out. The spine of each book is touched. Some textures are felt only now. In them, the writer places his own book in the attic and leaves you for you to continue your journey alone, but never without company. I've had to edit this a bit because I can't see the left-hand margin. But Estiran, could you make a comment? Could you unmute and make a comment?
Hola, yo soy Mari y te doy la bienvenida a un nuevo tutorial en crochet MC.
Right, because Siran is in India. He wasn't able to present the paper, but I know I think he's connected.
Vídeo que eu estou preparando com todo o meu carinho. Hoje eu trago para vocês essa linda pala de meias folhas, ideal para que você faça casaquinhos, vestidos, blusas.
Right, I'm not hearing. Okay. Right, we're having some technical situation. Okay. Uh,
I
perhaps-
don't think Ram is
Okay,
there.
right, okay, we can't reach the round, but at least if we could go to the last slide.
One moment if you want to hear.
uh, But Siram is this brilliant young Indian doctor. And I was so touched by his paper because it completely encapsulates what we are speaking about, Ruskin and India and so forth. Shall we go to the next slide where
Yeah.
let's talk? Okay.
不是偏中间位置。
One on screen. Yes. Okay. May a book work its spell on you. And now, if we could have Nicholas Mander give his talk, and we go to the next slide, which
物体上，
okay, to advance the slide. Right. Nicholas, can you come in? I know we did admit him.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, there's Nicholas. If you could,
Am I moving the slides on or?
那边就完成了。大家保守带的
Can you hear me all right? Am I going to move the slides on or can I have the first slide? Hello? Can you hear me? Julia, can you hear me? Hello? Hello?
Yes, Nicholas, we can hear you. Not sure, Julia.
How do I advance the slides? Can I have the first slide, maybe?
Now,
Hello? Can I have the first slide, please?
but I could,
you
How do I move the slides on? Are you going to do that, or is there a way I can do it here?
have to take.
So I'm moving them on fairly quickly. Can you move them on? How are we going to do it? Hello. Okay. So can I? Well, I'll start from the one before. Can I have the one before, please?
TT e NTATI, vediamo se così insomma evitiamo qualche tipo di problema, ma mi piace molto l'odore degli strike di prima mattina, profuma come devi.
Okay, can I that one? This is where I'm speaking from. Can you all hear me? Remote Cotswold Valley, in which I have lived for nearly 50 years, and where I am steeped, almost without realizing it, in the 19th century prophecy and poetry of John Ruskin. I want here to braid together Ruskin and his near contemporary Viollet-le-Duc, architects of spires and mountains, as stepping stones in my personal ode to the poets Dante and 600 years later, Yeats, all the way to India. I live as a caretaker of this small Cotswold manor house, set in a garden of 7 tiered terraces, which we come to later, climbing from the sublunary level by the stream to a chapel on the top level, with its star-spangled vault, a sort of empyrean, perhaps, which has survived almost miraculously with little alteration from medieval times. It owes that survival to repairs in 1925, following 80 years abandonment, adhering to Ruskinian precepts, which honored such old houses of the vernacular, so that Algernon Charles Swinburne could describe it in a letter to William Morris as a paradise incomparable on earth. I'm going to talk more about paradises. Could I have the next image, please? Can we have the next slide? That's it. A Ruskin, whose ideals inspired also the building of a group of family houses, of which this Whittick Manor, built in 1888 to 93, is today the most representative example, following its gift to the National Trust in 1937, as a paradigm of William Morris's House Beautiful. It is valued for its outstanding collections of literary manuscripts of the late Romantic period, of pre-Raphaelite paintings, and in decoration, its rich overlay of textures, of glass and fabric, plasterwork and murals, tiles, and self-consciously medievalizing timber. It is also noted for its connections with imperial India, when two sons of the household, exceptionally in Edwardian England, married two daughters of the Maharaja of Cooch Behar, who was connected by marriage to Rabindranath Tagore, about whom we'll hear later. Can I have the next slide? Perhaps indicated just such a revival of the so-called arts and crafts, and thereby the transformation of industrial society itself. But relevantly here also the careful and scholarly repair and reverent protection of ancient buildings, with stern watching, as he said, for the truth and aesthetic value of ruins and fragments. The parasitical sublime that derives from fortuity, from accidents of time, the picturesque, as Ruskin described it, say, in a painting by Tintoret, in the clefts and folds of shaggy hair, or in the chasms and rents of rocks, or in the hanging of thickets on hillsides, or in the alternations of gaiety and gloom, in the variegation of the shell, the plume, or the cloud. The Cotswolds were one of the most fertile breeding grounds for practitioners of what became known by Philip Webb, William Morris's own architect, as a school for practical building, in the circle of Ernest Jimpson and the brothers Ernest and Sidney Barnsley, seen here at Sapperton, and also of Eric Ashby and Chipping Camden. They derived from Ruskin their philosophy of repair, which led to the formation of the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings, with Ruskin's famous declaration, "It is impossible as to raise the dead, to restore anything that has ever been great or beautiful in architecture. That which I have above insisted upon as the life of the whole, that spirit which is given only by the hand and eye of the workman, can never be recalled. Another spirit may be given by another time. It is then a new building." The next slide, please. This is in stark contrast to the great 19th century French architect and theorist of the Gothic revival, Eugène Emmanuel Viollet-le-Duc. His interest in Gothic architecture was roused rather by Prosper Mérimée, romancier, inspector of monuments, and a close friend of the family, who secured for him his first important commission in 1840 to restore the Madeleine at Vézelay, which had been vandalized in the Revolution. In 1844, he and Lassus won the competition to restore the cathedral at Notre Dame de Paris. This is in our conscience today, when he added the whimsical flesh or spar made of oak covered with lead, prompting again, after the great fire recently, the debate over the ethics of repair versus restoration, which according to Ruskin's critique always falsifies the historical record which buildings embody. We have heard that the French Senate has in fact voted to rebuild Notre Dame with the requirement that it should be rebuilt to its last known visual state. Bucknell, Viollet's foremost English follower and translator was Benjamin Bucknell, who lived a few miles from here, and in 1857 replaced Augustus Welby Northmore Pugin. Can we have the next slide, please? And his own teacher, the Bristol architect Charles Francis Hanson, as the architect for Woodchester Park, which I hope we see on the next slide, please. We have The next slide. This unfinished masterpiece is within walking distance of where I live, built for a Catholic convert patron, William Lee, gloriously exhibiting Violet's principles of rational Gothic in its approach to function and structural unity. The supreme example of Violet's aesthetic in England, where all work was abandoned in 1873, and it survives as a curated ruin, suspended in and redeeming time. We look at the clock tower. Can we have the next slide, please? Which dominates the skyline of the building with a steep hipped roof, an architectural mountain with its horizontal courses striated, stratified, echeloned, in Yeats's word, like the laminations of rocks. Can we have the next slide, please? It is surmounted by spirelets, like an Indian temple, perhaps, echoing or copied as a mannerism in homage to Violet, who employs them in his roof designs, for example, here in the tower of the Porte du Croix at Nevers. Violet spent his summers from 1868 to 1876 studying Mont Blanc, resulting in his major scientific publication of 1876, entitled in Benjamin Bucknell's English translation. Can we have the next slide, please? Mont Blanc, a treatise on the geodesical and geological constitution, its transformations, and the ancient and recent state of its glaciers. He illustrated the work with his own 112 sketches and with his famous systematic map and chromolithographical plan or view of the Massif du Mont Blanc. Maybe the next slide. He describes the methodical analysis of mountains as a perfectly regulated crystalline system where primal forces operate in nature on the grandest scale, a process of ruination whereby a granite mammillated mass is crystallized under cooling or metamorphosed under pressure, with the decomposition of rhombohedral blocks splitting as water is filtered through the interstices of lamination and expanded into glacier seas, a process which organized the tectonics of the entire planet, as if the gigantic chaotic mass of Mont Blanc was a deliberate construction, a sublime work of architecture that can be restored to its rational ideal, seeing a hidden analogy between architecture, the study of buildings, and geology. The next slide, please. In 1836, Viollet-le-Duc had traveled from Mont Blanc into Italy, a voyage de formation, which, like Goethe's 50 years earlier, lasted more than a year, in quest, like Goethe also, of the classical, measuring and analyzing buildings. Can we have the next slide, please? Such as Santa Maria de Fiore, the Cathedral of Florence by Arnolfo di Cambio from 1240, in his appraisal of the first stirrings of Renaissance architecture. This had been seen as the critical moment of transition, which had sparked off what the French architectural critics had recognized as a third phase of cultural development, which had first manifested in Florence. Medieval structural skills were here melded with something of antique decorum. Can we have the next slide? To achieve a new synthesis, crowned here with a spire or flesh, which was in truth the dome, when the genius Brunelleschi in 1418 had derived from classical survivals, famously the Pantheon, dedicated in 135 AD in Hadrian's Rome. Next slide, please. Ruskin was 14 when he first saw the Alps and Mont Blanc on the occasion of his arrival with his parents at Schaffhausen in 1833. He recalled the impact and vision of the mountains upon him in his autobiography Praeterita, in a passage which we have just seen was to mark a turning point in the life of the young Marcel Proust in 1899. Suddenly, he wrote, behold, beyond, there was no thought in any of us for a moment of there being clouds, They were clear as crystal, sharp on the pure horizon sky, and already tinged with rose by the sinking sun. Can you move the next slide on? With so much of science mixed with feeling, as to make the sight of the Alps not only the revelation of the beauty of the earth, but the opening of the first page of its volume. I went down that evening from the garden terrace of Schaffhausen, with my destiny fixed in all of it that was to be sacred and useful. Next slide, please. The other way, yes. Ruskin was to visit Chamonix and the region of Mont Blanc Massif some 19 times between 1833 and 1888. No evidence, there is no evidence that he and Viollet-le-Duc ever met, but both came as amateur painters, pioneers of mountains, of the Alps in particular, meteorologists and geologists, collectors of specimens, ramblers and climbers, readers of Horace Benedict de Saussure's pioneering volumes of travels in the Alps, which Ruskin had requested for his 15th birthday. They traveled over the Alps into Italy within 3 years of one another, following a venerable line of poets and artists, including Turner and Goethe, Goethe the geologist, collector of specimens and minerals, who had set out for Italy over the Brenner Pass in 1786, frustrated in love, disguised as an artist, with a brace of pistols thrust in his belt as he headed for Venice. Ruskin, we think of for his love and wisdom expressed in the stones of Venice, though, like Goethe, he traveled as far as Sicily. He was lured on by the Turner vignettes, which Julie has just described, or insanities, as he called them, in Samuel Rogers' Italy, which had determined the main tenor of my life, he wrote. And of course, he too describes and sketches the stones of Florence, where he defers to Dante as the central man, exalting the ineffable tenderness in which Dante is always raised as much above all other poets, as in softness the rose above all other flowers. Ruskin's editor, Charles Eliot Norton, would write, "No other great English writer has shown such familiarity with the Divine Comedy as Mr. Ruskin." According, maybe we have the next slide. According to his account in Praeterita, Ruskin's Lecturae Dantis began during his journey to Europe without his parents in 1845. Ruskin's life, whether vita nuova or, with its disappointments, morte nuova, as he was to call it in 1867, has been described as a commentary on Dante's poetry, a text written upon its palimpsest, but is also itself. After 1845, we are told, there is no work of Ruskin's without overt and submerged Dantean reference, from conversations on mineralogy for schoolgirls to critiques of political economy. J. Fellows illustrated the essential relation between the two figures, the circular and the labyrinthine, which provides this structuring element in Ruskin's imaginative and aesthetic maturation. Dante's dream poem is figured round circles, triads, in its threefold structure. And we're going to talk about the 7 terraces we see here, circling the mount of the Purgatorio, and the 9 spheres in the highest heaven. Ruskin has long passages, perhaps a quarter of one of the modern painter's volumes, describing the Dantesque landscape, including an exhaustive critique of Dante's and the medieval mind's take on mountains, comparing, for example, a mountain background in Ghirlandaio to one in the Liber Veritatis by Claude, or Dante's descriptions of the colors and textures of rocks, their frangibility, as he calls them, or breakableness, as he knew them, Dante, ignorant of petrology and stratification in the Apennines, and of the mountain streams which flow black, Ruskin says, in Cumberland, like porter. He finds Dante's Mount of Purgatory is literary and unconvincing. The place of the soul's purification, though a mountain, is yet by Dante subdued, wherever there is any pleasantness to be found upon it, from all mountainous character into grassy terraced recesses or slopes to rushy shore, and in his general conception of it resembles much more a castle mound surrounded by terraced walks. He allows himself a suspension of disbelief in the enchantment of Dante's dream landscapes, but Ruskin, steeped in the Longinian sublime and the 18th century picturesque tradition deriving from Gilpin and Turner, doubts the Italian poet's first-hand experience or joy of mountains. In this passage, he says, "The fact is that Dante, by many expressions throughout the poem, shows himself to have been a notably bad climber, and being fond of sitting in the sun, looking at his fair baptistry, or walking in a dignified manner on flat pavement in a long road. When he has a very steep place to go down, Virgil has to carry him altogether, and is obliged to encourage him again and again when they have a steep slope to go up, the first ascent of the Purgatorial Mountain." Can we have the next slide, please? Can we have the next slide? Yes, I just want to show you Ghirlandaio. He singles out as an illustrative of Dante's idea of terraces on the Purgatorial Mountain in this background depiction of the road by which the Magi descend in his picture of the Adoration of the Shepherds in the Accademia at Florence. Although the Inferno is just as accurately measured and divided as the Purgatory, it is nevertheless cleft into rocky chasms which possess something of true mountain nature, nature which to the great Florentine appeared adapted only for the punishment of lost spirits, proclaims its detestation of hardness and ruggedness. He describes Dante's immitigable dislike of clouds. Perhaps we can have the next slide. Dante excludes all clouds from joyous or holy settings, reserving them strictly for the punishment of sinners. Dante thus carries the medieval joy in light to its logical limit, as he retains steadily through circle after circle his cloudless thought, and concludes his painting of heaven as he began it upon the Purgatorial Mountain with the image of shadowless morning. Can we have the next slide, please? So we had the castle mound surrounded by terraced walks, which call to mind, can we have the next slide already, please? They call to mind the mythological garden, which Ruskin created in old age at Brantford, with its ziggy-zaggy terraces, said to be laid out in imitation of the Mountain of Purgatory, now restored and based on sketches that Ruskin made in the 1870s as the paradise of terraces. This Ruskin conceived as an entrance to the lakeside garden, recreating the journey of the soul to paradise on the Purgatorial Mount. Each of the 7 zigzaggy terraces from Purgatorio of suffering and spiritual growth in Dante, carved into the rock faces of the mountain, is devoted to purging one of the 7 deadly sins. They rise from the river of Styx, as Dante describes it, flowing at the base of malignant grey cliffs in the 5th circle of the Inferno, to the 1st circle of paradise, which is recreated at Brantwood as the painter's glade. Can we have the next slide, please? Well, here, the Purgatorial terraces echo perhaps the 7 gardens of paradise of the Muslim East. Dante's mountain-centeredness and eschatology link to the creative imagination which Henri Corbin describes in their theophanic visions of the great Mercian mystical poet and Platonist Ibn al-Arabi. Miguel Assin Palacios argued in 1919 that Dante used sources derived from Islamic Spain and plausibly Sicily, and more broadly from the East through Indo-Iranian sources, a hypothesis dating to the late 18th century, but often dismissed as controversial or overstated, which has been styled a scandalous chapter in the history of Dante's scholarship. The later discovery of the Liber Scale Macometti, with its narration of Muhammad's night voyage to hell and paradise by an Isra, a nocturnal journey during which the Prophet visited the infernal regions of the other world, has only served to revive the controversy. There are many foldings and cross influences where Dante's work is a centerpiece with Summa-like or encyclopedic qualities, bringing together universal strands, preeminent not just in medieval culture, but enduring into our own times. So I come to end with Yeats, three of the great modernist poets of the English language. Can we have the next slide, please? In the early 20th century, Ezra Pound, T.S. Eliot, and William Butler Yeats, all in their various ways paid homage to Dante as the core of their work. It's time to just take Yeats as the last link in this imaginative and hypothetical chain, forging a connection between Ruskin, Dante, and the wisdom of the East as a viable triad of influences. Yeats spent 4 years, 1884 to 7, in early life as a paint-stained art student, Maud Gonne would write, in the Dublin art colleges under John Ruskin's aesthetic. In the opening sentence of the first draft of his autobiography, begun in 1915, he states that, like Gandhi, I began to read Ruskin's Unto This Last, and this, when added to my interest in psychical research and mysticism, enraged my father, who was a disciple of John Stuart Mill. One night, a quarrel over Ruskin came to such a height that in putting me out of the room, he broke the glass in a picture with the back of my head. Can we have the next slide, please? The world of the visual arts defines and permeates the poetic career of Yeats, with his devotion to William Blake and the ancients, Edward Calvert and Palmer, child of the arts and crafts movement, steeped in Morris and the Kelmscott Press, maintaining abiding friendships with Thomas Sturge Moore, William Rothenstein, Charles Ricketts, Charles Shannon, and many others. Can we have the next slide, please? He refined his interest in the book arts and maintained rigid supervision of the production of his poetic output from In the Seven Woods of 1903, his first book produced by Dun Emma Industries, established in Dublin, with the poet's sisters, spinster sisters, Elizabeth, called Lolly, and Susan, Lily, with Yeats as literary advisor. Lily's Koala Press issued elegant books, most of them books of Yeats's own poetry, as they arrived and before they were commercially published. The format of established a template for all Yeats's ensuing poetry collections. Dante Alighieri and Yeats were born almost exactly 600 years apart on June the 13th, 1865, and late May or early June, 1265. Again, Dante was a core influence in what the critic George Bornstein calls Yeats's antimonial thought, hammering his thoughts into unity on his spiritual quest for what he called unity of being, using the term as Dante used it, Yeats wrote, when he compared beauty in the convivio to a perfectly proportioned human body. My father, from whom I had learned the term, preferred a comparison to a musical instrument, so strung that if we touch a string, all the strings murmur faintly. Can we have the next slide? From his early study of the occult and the theosophy of Madame Blavatsky, Rosicrucianism, the Golden Dawn, Plotinus, the Swedenborgian visions of Blake, the illustrator of Dante's Inferno, his critical meeting with Rabindranath Tagore, for whom he wrote the introduction for his Gitanjali, to Hindu Vedic philosophy, psychical research, and Japanese no plays, all were heterogeneous themes in Keats's syncretic quest, where Eastern religion was from early days a core, if dilettante, interest. He professed in 1937 I have fed upon the philosophy of the Upanishads all my life. For some 40 years, my friend George Russell, who is known as A.E., has quoted me passages from some Upanishad. The imagery of purgatorial quest is always present in place, the table-topped Mensa of Ben Bulbin's head, 1,700 feet high, which dominates the Sligo landscape, and eventually Yeats's own tombstone with its Siste Viator legend. The quest is present too in Yeats's perennial images of the gyres, the winding stair, his mystical journey to the east, symbolized by sailing to Byzantium. His tower house at Tor Ballylee becomes a symbol of the lonely tower described by Milton in Il Penseroso and Shelley in The Prince of Athanasi, and realized in the famous etching here by Samuel Palmer, the tower, where the lamp bursts for the hermit poet, reading alone in the dark, the seeker of mysterious wisdom won by toil. Later in his life, Thomas Sturge Moore introduced Yeats to Sri Purohit Swami, poet, Vedantist philosopher, and Hindu monk, and they formed a close literary partnership. His interest in the Upanishads was reawakened, and they went on to collaborate in their translation of the 10 principal Upanishads in Majorca in 1935. As a disciple and biographer of Sri Bhagwan Hamsa, Purohit Swami gave a series of lectures on the Bhagavad Gita, the 700-line allegorical song about the moral dilemma of the battlefield, which is the core of Hindu spirituality. Can we have the next slide, please? A Hindu temple, can we have the next slide, is a symbolic house, the seat and dwelling place of the gods of the pantheon. As Jorge Luis Borges writes, the smile of Shiva. It is a structure designed to promote what might be called Yeatsian unity of being, that sympathetic harmony of humans and gods, typically built on an elaborately carved plinth. The temple is referred to in Hindu texts on architecture, the Vastu Shastras, as the sacred mountain, Meru or Kailash, the throne of Shiva in the Himalayas. Seen from afar, and especially from above, many Dravidian temples with their monumental towers or gopurams, often as here of 7 levels, take their form of a mountain mass or spire, derived from that same pyramidal form, the hipped wedge, which the Leduc had used on his tower spires, paradigms for the one at Woodchester Park. Can we have the next slide, please? Yeats, it's the last slide, late in life became fascinated by the Kailash legend. He was too unwell to realize his voyage to India, but his late essay, The Holy Mountain, served as an introduction to Sri Purohit Swami's translation of the account by Sri Hamsa of his pilgrimage and initiation on Mount Kailash, a place I have myself visited, the purgatorial mountain of the East, when, quote, he had in meditation been ordered to seek Turiya, the greater or conscious samadhi, bliss bound to no aim, at Mount Kailash. Yeats writes of the spiral's vacant center, the still point at the bedded axle tree, where the wars on God begin, where all the serpent tails are bit, where all the gyres converge in one. His own poem, Meru, is one of the polemics of the smiling public man in his old age, ravening that he might come into the desolation of reality, as he put it. It appeared in his last work, Parnell's Funeral and Other Poems, describing hermits upon Mount Meru or Everest, caverned in night under the drifted snow. Well, the serpent tails of the Ouroboros come back to the beginning. Yeats observes of Kailash, the strata are echeloned. We too have learnt from Dante to imagine our Eden, or earthly paradise upon a mountain, as penitential rings upon the slope. So thank you very much. That is the end.
Nicholas, thank you very much. That map by Ruskin, that 1885 map of India, which book is that from? What context is he working in?
Send it to you. Could you see it all right? It's got the pole. He shows shows how methodically interested he was in things. I mean, I think it might belong to in Lancaster to the Guild of St. George. I'm not sure if anyone here knows it, but yes, I found it in a sort of web search. I think. I'm not sure whether he writes about India, Ruskin, particularly, but he was obviously, his interests were polymathic, weren't they? Yeah. So, can you enlighten me about temple architecture in India? It's a sort of lifetime's wish to visit, but I've never visited one. But I think those towers that I was showing you are actually portals or gateways, aren't they?
They are indeed supposed to be, and it's quite beautifully structured, quite methodically as well. There is an inner sanctorum where the main deity is, which is, believe it or not, absolutely bare of all decoration. Whereas the external faces, the facade is full, brimming full of all the gods and goddesses.
Showed image niches and sort of cut it, yes, beautifully disciplined. And then it's on a mandala form very often in plan, is it?
That's right.
Some of these temples are acres. I mean, they're 20 acres. Yeah, fascinating. But I think those ones I was showing you are southern Indian. Is that right there?
They are northern Indian. We could talk about them as well, maybe sometime else. The temples of Khajuraho, once again, you might want to look at them as well. Their structure. They are in Madhya Pradesh, central India.
Thank you very much to visit.
Right. Sorry, I'm too close to the microphone. I think at this point, we do need how many people will be coming? Hands up. It's lunch. Allora, abbiamo dovuto avere la sua Nicholas va bene per lei parlare dopo 5 minuti. Can you speak after 5 minutes? I think Nicholas Haverly is iPad, am I right?
I'm on a computer, yes.
Okay, no, do we not have Nicholas Haverly?
Another Nicholas.
Oh, right. Okay. All right, we'll come back after a 10-minute break to speak on Queen Victoria. Is that all right with everyone? But I would like to make one comment about the mountains and the terraces, because Dante is also using Monte that in the Renaissance was used for crafting all of the Pietra Serena stone and had this.
Hello.
We lost that aspect when the English planted cypress trees all over Mountain Edgeley. But that is also where Leonardo da Vinci was doing his aeroplane experiment. So we'll see you again in 10 minutes. Yes. Could you? Yes,
Hello,
yes,
can you hear me?
yes, I can hear you. And who are,
Yeah, right. Am I due to start now?
are you Nicholas Haverley?
Yes, yes.
All right. Can you wait 10 minutes? Is that all right with you?
Okay, I'll wait 10 minutes. Okay, yes, that's fine.
And I do apologize about getting you in the wrong sequence.
Right. Okay, well, I'm
Better.
okay to get started in 10 minutes. I
That's
do have to leave at, well, it's 11 o'clock my time. It'll be 12 o'clock your time. But
That's
so
fine.
there's plenty of time. Okay,
Okay, thank you.
right. Okay,
Thank
so
you.
10 minutes time.
Yes. Okay. See,
E si inizia,
Ok.
se qualcuno la sente.
Sì, bene. Grazie mille per questo. perché-
No, no, mi dispiace solo per l'audio, ma non c'è modo di fare altrimenti.
Sì. E io sono un po'
Sì,
sorda.
non c'è problema.
Trovo che tocca questo aiuto. E così che sì, Nicholas. Sì.
Hello.
E penso che se iniziamo in 2 minuti, if we begin in 2 minutes, will that be all right?
Yes, yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Can he hear me? Am I muted or not?
No, we're okay. Yes, I can hear you.
If
Yes.
he share his monitor,
Right.
he has to share.
Has it been interesting to you so far?
Yeah, well, yes. I have some notes about mountains because I'm actually giving a paper in Chieti next week on which is called Dante's Mountains,
Wonderful, yes.
Le Montagne di Dante. And it's actually mostly about 19th century pursuers of Dante in the mountains.
Ah, that sounds lovely. And you know John Demaray's book on the Divine Comedy.
On the, yeah, right,
And
yes, yes. I mean,
he actually climbed Mount Sinai, seeing its relationship to Mount Purgatory.
right.
So I did too. And it's quite true that those gates and terraces, they're there on Mount Sinai. They were connected to St. Catherine's Monastery.
Mhm.
And the monks heard the confessions of the pilgrims at the gates. So
Mm.
it completely fits the purgatory.
Yeah.
And also Dante's doing a composite of Montececheri and Mount Sinai.
Yeah, there's also an article by Carol Kasky.
Yes, I know that, yes.
That point, yeah, similar, well, sort of similar points. Yeah, yeah. I'm actually more interested in the Apennini, really, as because that's the book that I'm writing at the moment.
Very good, yeah.
Mm.
Right. Penso che ora iniziamo con la relazione. Sì, ok. Benvenuto. Questo è della famiglia dei Conti Guidi e ho dovuto dare a lui il mio libro su Brunetto con tutte le documentazioni su Guido Guerra. La sua famiglia. And we're going to begin talking now. Professor Nicholas Havali, who is speaking about Joseph Garrow, his research he has been on the 19th century response to Dante. And I give the floor to Professor Havali, whose mother is from India.
Sorry, whose father is from India? My father was from India. Yeah, right. My mother was British.
You want to, do you need screen sharing?
No, I don't, because I don't have non o diapositivi, non c'è.
Okay,
no, okay, okay.
Right.
Right. Can I? Yeah. I'll begin then, shall I? Shall I begin now? Okay. Can you, mi può sentire? Hello? Okay. Yep, so I'll start. Incominciano? Hello? Sorry, yeah. Okay, yeah, right. Well, thanks for to Julia for organizing this very interesting hybrid conference and international conference. And the dialogue between Italy and India is a fascinating one. I have had a chat message asking for the title of my forthcoming book on the Apennini. And if that person wants to know, it will be published by Oxford University Press, and the title, it will be published later this year or early next year, and the title is Apennine Crossings, Travelers on the Edge of Tuscany, published by Oxford University Press. Okay, time is a bit short, so I'm going to try, as we agreed, to keep to the 20-minute length. So I'll begin now to talk about an Anglo-Indian, Anglo-Florentine translator, Joseph Garrow, and a version of Dante's Vita Nuova. British interest in Dante's Vita Nuova, his early collection of love lyrics with his own commentary, developed quite late. It is evident to some extent among Italianate romantics such as the Shelleys and Leigh Hunt, and significant amounts of translation of the poems of the Vita Nuova appear in the 1830s in the work, for example, of Tennyson's friend Arthur Hallam, and the published versions of the Vita Nuova poems by Charles Lyell, father of the more famous geologist. But the first complete translation of the whole work, including the prose narrative, was published in Florence in 1846, although it has been overshadowed by later 19th century versions, such as those by Dante Gabriel Rossetti and Charles Eliot Norton. The Early Life of Dante Alighieri, which is the title of this translation, the 1846 translation, is the first complete and published translation by Joseph Garrow, who was born in India in 1789 and died in Florence in 1857. It has been largely ignored, even in the scholarship of Dante reception. The monumental collection of sources for Dante in English literature by Paget Toynbee does not quote from it and refers to it only in a footnote to a section on the earlier versions by Charles Lyell, of the poems by Charles Lyell. A major 20th century monograph on Dante in English poetry by Steve Ellis gives the early life of Garrow very little attention, regarding its influence in England as, quote, naturally limited because of its publication in Florence. In the present century, Garrow's translation has become even less visible, and it does not even feature in the indexes to recent major studies of the reception of the Vita Nuova. Yet, as a brief article by George Watson in 1986 suggested, Garrow's early life of Dante is a significant first, and there is more evidence now available about the author, the contexts, and the reception. As these compound adjectives, Anglo-Indian, Anglo-Florentine, in my title may suggest, I'm approaching Joseph Garrow and his translation from a mixture of motives and directions. As a semi-Dantista, I'm interested in developments, especially 19th century developments, in the reception of texts such as the Vita Nuova and the Divina Commedia. More personally, being myself of mixed Parsi and British parentage, my father was Parsi, my mother British, I'm also interested in Garrow's Anglo-Indian origins and in how, as such, he made his way in early 19th century British and Italian society and culture. There are, you will see, many gaps in my account, hence quite ample scope remains for further research on this subject. The information that I've so far been able to glean about Garrow's parentage and his own early life is quite sparse. His father, also named Joseph Garrow, was born in 1757, one of the 10 children of the Reverend David Garrow, a schoolmaster of Scottish descent, teaching at Hadley, Middlesex, near London. Following his elder brother Edward, Joseph Garrow Sr., as I shall call him, became a writer in the British East India Company in 1779 and subsequently a senior merchant. He became secretary to the commander-in-chief of the Madras Presidency Army, Colonel William Meadows, and acted as the East India Company's steward, responsible for plate, furniture, and fixtures in government houses in Madras, now Chennai. In 1781, he is recorded as present at a meeting to discuss the threat of a French attack on the presidency. And in 1790, during the Mysore War, Joseph Garrow Sr. was appointed to a committee, quote, for the purpose of investigating charges of corruption and peculation against a former governor of Madras and his associates. Like other colonial officials of the time, such as Charles Hindoo Stewart, buried in Kolkata, and most famously, William Dalrymple's White Mughals, Joseph Sr. had a long-term relationship with an Indian woman whose name Sultan or Sultana suggests she was a Muslim. So far as I'm aware, all that is known about her is in the will that Joseph Sr. himself wrote sometime before his death in 1792, leaving Sultan or Sultana a lifetime allowance and a house. The subject of this paper, their 2-year-old son, Joseph, was more amply provided for in his father's will. He was left a trust fund of £5,000 for his education, a personal legacy of £2,000, and the stipulation that if it was not possible for him to be brought up properly in India, he should be sent to England, where his aunt was tasked with supervising his education after the age of 16. In the event, the infant Joseph Garrow, the subject of this paper, was sent to England almost immediately after his father's death in 1792, and was put into the care of one of his father's other siblings, the prominent lawyer, Sir William Garrow, a famous jurist and pioneering defence counsel, whose early career is the subject of a BBC courtroom drama series, Garrow's Law. After the death of Joseph's aunt, Eleonora, who left him a legacy of £1,000, the young Joseph took his BA and MA degrees at Cambridge, St John's, and began legal training in 1810 at Lincoln's Inn. In 1812, he married a well-to-do widow and contralto singer, Theodosia Abrams Fisher, one of the famous Abrams sisters duo, and then lived for over 20 years with her in Torquay, where he served as a magistrate, and the family became active in the musical life of Devon. Music was one of Garrow's main interests. His son-in-law, Thomas Adolphus Trollope, whose memoirs are a source for much of the information, some of it misleading, about Garrow's life, describes him as an accomplished violinist. In 1835, Garrow published a book of sacred music arranged for 4 voices and selected, as the title page says, quote, from that usually sung in St John's Chapel, Torquay. Alongside some works of major composers such as Handel, Mozart, Beethoven, and Weber, Garrow included some of his own, a mini Christmas oratorio, several hymns, and settings of 5 psalms. Mrs. Garrow, Theodosia Abrams Fisher, also contributed to the collection, which more unexpectedly includes a couple of compositions by Miss Garrow, the couple's 18-year-old daughter, also named Theodosia, whose accomplishments and connections are a significant part, as I shall argue, of the context for Joseph Garrow's later Dante translation. In 1844, the 27-year-old Theodosia's fragile health, this is the daughter of the elder Theodosia and Joseph Garrow. Theodosia's health was a reason for the whole Garrow family relocating to Florence. Evidence about Joseph Garrow's Florentine contacts is also fairly meagre, though more evident than that of his Indian parentage. And I've regrettably no knowledge of any correspondence, journals, or notes that he or others might have kept during his Florentine years. Like many expatriates, Garrow is known to have frequented the Vieux library on his arrival in Florence, and I find that he signed the Libro dei Sorci, the register at the Gabinetto of Vieux, on the 21st of October 1844, giving his address as number 4350 Piazza Santa Maria Novella. Amongst his acquaintances were those with some prominent members of the Anglo-Florentine community. Frances Trollope and her son Thomas Adolphus, then living in the Via dei Malcontenti, and the poet and essayist Walter Savage Landor, already spoken of today. Landor had known the Garrows during their years in Devon. Thomas Trollope's 1887 memoirs, What I Remember, somewhat unreliable memoirs in some ways, are again a source for the early stage of Garrow's relationship with Landor. Chapter 18 of Trollope's memoir includes 3 letters from Landor to Garrow during the late 1830s, when both were in England, indicating Landor's interest in the young Theodosia's poetry and referring to both correspondents' close friendship with the Piedmontese exile Giovanni Bezzi d'Aubre, who would in July 1840 share in the discovery of the Bargello portrait, supposedly of Dante by Giotto, supposedly. Landor during Garrow's years in Florence, and on Garrow's death in 1857, he's buried in the English cemetery there, Landor composed an epitaph for him, a jokey but affectionate tribute, which ends like a medieval mortality lyric. I quote, "Now, genial, hospitable Garrow, thy door is closed, thy house is narrow." Landor had received a copy of Garrow's The Early Life of Dante Alighieri, the translation of the Vita Nuova, and he annotated the preface of it. His annotations are in the copy in the British Library. And Landor here registers some vigorous disagreements with the translator. For instance, Garrow's idea of the Vita Nuova as, quote, the foundation of all the romances which have since been written, this is in Garrow's introduction, is one which Landor dismisses in a pencil note as simply absurd. Another key relationship during Garrow's Florentine years was that with his talented daughter Theodosia, who I've referred to already. Born in 1816, Garrow had gained fame as a poet by the late 1830s. She would become a much more prolific translator than her father, and achieved, as the inscription on her tomb in the English cemetery says, she achieved some cultural and political prominence among the expatriate community in Florence. Her early verses, published in 1839 when she was still in England, drew the attention of both Elizabeth Barrett and Walter Savage Landor. And soon after the family had moved to Florence, she herself turned to Italian texts. Described by the American journalist Kate Field as possessed of, quote, great intellectual gifts, Theodosia translated political poems by Italian nationalist authors such as the satirist Giuseppe Giusti, and plays by the then censored Republican dramatist Giovanni Battista Nicolini. Following her marriage to Thomas Adolphus Trollope in 1848, Theodosia collaborated with him in editing the short-lived English language journal, the Tuscan Athenaeum, and her influential articles on the Risorgimento for the London Athenaeum were collected and later reprinted with the title of Social Aspects of the Italian Revolution. So she becomes something of an authority on the Risorgimento for English readers. Now, although some of Theodosia Garrow's most significant translation work coincided in time with her father's work on his version of the Vita Nuova, there is unfortunately no written record of any conversations between them on the subject of Dante or Italian literature. However, amongst Theodosia's many poems is one on the discovery of the Bargello portrait of Dante, which features as the frontispiece to her father's version of the Vita Nuova, and Theodosia's translation of Nicolini's 1843 revolutionary drama Arnaldo da Brescia, itself concerned with a medieval subject, was composed at about the same time as Joseph Garrow's translation of the early life of Dante Alighieri. Given the closeness of Theodosia's relationship with Garrow, noted by Thomas Trollope in his memoirs, and her talent for verse and languages, especially Italian, it seems to me very probable that father and daughter would at some point have discussed the Vita Nuova translation project over the Florentine winter, during which Garrow was working on his version of the Dantean text, the winter of 1845. But that is a significant silence. Theodosia, however, was obviously one of the, quote, literary persons in Italy with whom, as her father put it in his preface to the early life, it was his, quote, good fortune to converse. Finally, I have some further evidence about the material afterlife of Garrow's Dante translation. It was published by the Florentine firm founded in 1837 by the Franco-Italian entrepreneur Félix Lemonnier, who had made his way in business by following the nationalist current, sometimes in very inventive ways. From 1849 to 3 years after the Garrow's translation, from 1849 to 1864, Lemonier's bestseller list was actually topped by Dante. He published, he sold 22,000 copies of Dante's Commedia, and indeed even 3 editions of the Vita Nuova in the original, which sold 3,500 copies during the same period. So it seems to me that Joseph Garrow may have been envisaging more Florentine sales when he designed his own translation as a parallel text for, as he put it in his introduction, Italians studying English as well as English studying Italian. If so, if he was hoping for wider sales, he would have been disappointed. Unlike Lyell's Canzoniere, the earlier translations of the poems from the Vita Nuova, Garrow's early life of Dante, the complete version, would not be reprinted. The text of it is indeed, copies of the text are indeed quite rare, although not as rare as George Watson's 1986 article suggested. There are at least 15 copies in UK libraries and 5 in the USA. The book was owned not only by Landor, the copy in the British Library, but also, for example, John Forster, the biographer of Dickens, by a later translator of the Vita Nuova, the American Charles Eliot Norton, and it was owned by major Dante scholars of the later 19th century, such as Henry Clark Barlow, Edward Moore, and Herman Ursner. The early reviews were mixed, the early reviews of Garrow's translation, but they recognize the importance of the complete Vita Nuova with the prose as well as the poetry, as one of them put it, now for the first time being given to English readers. First and most closely attentive of the reviews was the one that appeared in the Athenaeum in the same year as the publication, 1846. It noted the existence of Charles Lyell's, quote, excellent version of the poems, whilst welcoming the new attempt at, quote, presenting this extraordinary production, the Vita Nuova, in its integrity. It went on to quote extensively from Garrow's preface and from the translation itself, concluding with the recommendation that, quote, all who may should procure the present translation, which is described as, quote, faithful and spirited, even when the fidelity does not create an elegant impression. The early life of Dante by this Anglo-Indian, Anglo-Florentine translator was thus a neglected, though not entirely forgotten book, and one whose own reception would, I suggest, reflect some features of Dante's scholarship and the developing cult of the Vita Nuova in the 19th century. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Howard. The splendid account. And I should like to thank all the
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Right, oh, sorry. I was saying that I was able to buy a copy of the earlier life of Dante. And the reason why it didn't sell, the title was wrong. People didn't realize it was Vita Nova. But there was a company in Delhi republishing books, and I ordered a copy, and it came with the most beautiful leather binding in Indian style through COVID. And I also discovered you, and we talked about Joseph Gannett. And so all of this information together, Florence, India, England, connect, and Dante. Thank you very much. And now,
You're welcome.
who is going to be speaking on Queen Victoria, and he will be speaking in Italian. Right, with me, sit there with the microphone. See what.
Qui ho un rarissimo opuscolo che desidererei far girare e farvelo vedere, che descrive dopo circa 20 anni dalla visita.
Ok, prova.
Mi sentite? Va bene?
Sì.
Descrive dopo circa 20 anni con fotografie della visita della regina Vittoria a Firenze, la villa con fotografie, la villa Palmieri, dove la regina Vittoria alloggiò e dove fecero venire appositamente per lei la prima linea telefonica. Siamo all'inizio degli anni 90. Mi sentite? Siamo all'inizio degli anni 90 dell'Ottocento, quando il telefono ad uso privato era quasi ancora inesistente. Negli anni 80 e 90 dell'Ottocento i telefoni erano solo ad uso uffici pubblici. Quindi fare venire una linea telefonica dalla città di Firenze fino a Villa Palmieri, che è all'altezza di via Boccaccio, dopo Piazza delle Cure per intenderci, era già una novità. E ancora adesso a Villa Palmieri ci sono tutte le attrezzature sanitarie, lavandini, il cosiddetto WC, chiamiamolo così, che per l'Italia era ancora praticamente inesistente. Ci si lavava ancora nelle tinozze, nelle bacinette. Fecero venire da Londra tutti i servizi sanitari appositamente per la regina e anche una forma di ascensore. Voi sapete che Vittoria, dopo la nascita di 9 figli, si era notevolmente appesantita di peso e quindi era molto faticoso per lei fare le scale e fecero, e c'è ancora, naturalmente non più in funzione, una sorta di rudimentale ascensore. Pensate che si parla di 130 anni fa, quindi potete immaginarvi come erano gli ascensori, e con questo ascensore lei poteva salire al primo piano e accedere alla sua camera da letto.
È acceso. Scusate.
Prego.
Sì, qui va bene.
Grazie. Quindi, anche per muoversi in giardino, aveva il cosiddetto donkey car. Era un carretto che veniva portato da Abdul, portato da un asinello, con cui poteva tranquillamente fare le passeggiate nel giardino della villa. E c'è ancora un bellissimo cedro del Libano che è stato piantato da lei ed resta lì a perenne memoria. La villa ha conservato molto, ecco, ve la faccio vedere, se potete farla girare. La villa ha conservato molto del suo fascino. Quello che è stato considerato in seguito, fino ai giorni nostri, una relazione, diciamo così, sentimentale, amorosa, queste erano le critiche che venivano mosse allora, tra la regina Vittoria e Abdul, in realtà era sì una relazione amorosa sentimentale, ma era una relazione amorosa sentimentale da parte della regina Vittoria per l'India, per la cultura indiana, per la storia dell'India e anche per la loro lingua. Voi dovete capire che quando Vittoria fu proclamata imperatrice delle Indie, né prima né dopo è mai stata, non c'era mai stata in India e non ci andò nemmeno dopo. Per cui per lei era veramente un'incognita, era qualcosa che esulava dal suo modo di vedere, dal suo modo di pensare, dal suo modo di agire, dalla sua lingua. Non ne conosceva la lingua, non ne conosceva gli usi, non ne conosceva i costumi, non sapeva niente, a parte quello che si era affrettatamente sì, dedicata ad imparare. Quindi la presenza di 2 camerieri indiani che le furono mandati direttamente dall'India, presero prima un treno, arrivarono a Bombay e poi partirono, arrivarono in Inghilterra, arrivarono a Windsor, anche loro completamente ignari di quello che li aspettava. Li avevano un po' istruiti agli usi e ai costumi della corte, naturalmente, ed erano stati scelti sia per la loro presenza, perché dovevano essere anche di bell'aspetto, ma soprattutto erano stati scelti perché venivano da un substrato culturale che gli permetteva anche una facilità nell'apprendere le lingue. Il padre di Abdul era un medico in un ospedale indiano e aveva lavorato, sia il padre che Abdul avevano lavorato nelle carceri, erano medici e guardiani delle carceri. Quando questi carcerati indiani dovevano imparare, gli insegnavano un mestiere. Nel momento in cui sarebbero usciti dalla prigione, dovevano aver appreso un mestiere. E gli avevano insegnato a tessere e a ricamare e a produrre tappeti. Quando a una mostra in Inghilterra la regina Vittoria visitò e vide queste produzioni di tappeti che avevano fatto i carcerati in India, restò particolarmente colpita. Ripeto, non conosceva niente dei costumi, degli usi, di come si ricamava, di come si tesseva un tappeto in India. Quindi rimase molto colpita ed espresse il desiderio di avere, mi sentite? Ed espresse il desiderio di avere al suo servizio 2 camerieri indiani. Nel giugno del 1887 Abdul e l'altro cameriere che era stato addetto al servizio personale della regina Vittoria arrivarono a Windsor. Adesso voi potete immaginare 2 uomini giovani, per quanto appartenenti a un livello culturale abbastanza elevato, ripeto, Abdul era figlio di un medico, per cui erano persone che avevano potuto studiare, avevano potuto apprendere le lingue, insomma, l'inglese non lo sapevano per niente, diciamo. E gli fu affrettatamente insegnato quel poco di inglese che serviva per essere al servizio personale della regina. Per essere al servizio personale della regina, in realtà occorreva parlare pochissimo, perché la dote principale che annota la regina Vittoria stessa nel suo diario è, nei diari della regina Vittoria, il giorno del primo incontro con Abdul e l'altro cameriere, quindi del suo primo incontro diretto personale con delle persone indiane che le erano così vicine che la servivano a tavola personalmente, per cui vicinissime a lei. Il primo commento che la regina Vittoria fa: sono silenziosi. Questa era la dote principale. Chi serviva non doveva parlare. Queste erano le regole molto rigide della corte inglese, specialmente in epoca vittoriana. A poco si instaurò tra la regina Vittoria e Abdul, che poi ebbe il titolo di Munshi, un rapporto più confidenziale che fu travisato, ed è tuttora travisato anche dalla cinematografia più recente. Ricordo quel bellissimo film con Judi Dench, Vittoria Abdul. Ma anche nel film stesso, che tutti credo noi abbiamo visto, si intravede, si capisce che il rapporto tra la regina Vittoria e Abdul era più un rapporto, sì, confidenziale, che aveva fatto ingelosire tutti gli altri componenti dello staff reale e anche gli stessi figli della regina, perché, come voi sapete, il re d'Inghilterra è anche una figura sacra. Oltre che re d'Inghilterra, è capo della religione. È un po' quello che si potrebbe essere un corrispondente di un nostro Papa quasi, perché è difensore della fede. Quindi c'è la famosa regola ancora adesso, se ne è parlato tanto, anche recentemente, negli ultimi anni, la regina d'Inghilterra, quando per esempio qualche capo di Stato straniero si prende delle confidenze e abbraccia la regina, non si deve fare, perché il re, la regina d'Inghilterra, oltre che al ruolo di capo di Stato, ha anche una funzione sacra. In questo caso, siamo nell'Ottocento, era l'incontro di due culture, la cultura indiana, che se vogliamo era molto più antica, era molto più gloriosa della cultura inglese occidentale. Gli indiani avevano una cultura ben più antica, e la cultura anglosassone. La regina capì che attraverso quest'uomo, un giovane uomo naturalmente, un uomo anche, insomma, diciamolo pure, lo vediamo anche dai ritratti, un uomo giovane e attraente, e soprattutto che aveva l'attrattiva di avere qualcosa di insolito, qualcosa che una donna, qualsiasi donna a metà della seconda metà dell'Ottocento non aveva mai avvicinato un uomo di questo, un uomo indiano, giovane e, diciamolo pure, intelligente. A poco si instaurò un rapporto di tale dialogo, che non è un dialogo più tra due persone, è un dialogo tra due culture. Quindi attraverso Abdul, la tanto chiacchierata storia tra Vittoria e Abdul non è una storia sentimentale. Sì, è una storia sentimentale, ma è una storia sentimentale tra due culture. Attraverso Abdul, la regina imparò affrettatamente le parole chiave per poter ricevere dei dignitari indiani e parlare nella loro lingua. Non c'era mai stato nessuno che si era preso l'incarico di insegnare alla regina Vittoria come si parla e come si riceve un dignitario indiano. Nello stesso modo, la regina insegnava al suo cameriere personale personalmente, non demandava nessuno dei suoi dignitari o delle persone che le erano più vicine. Lei stessa, nei dialoghi sempre più frequenti tra la regina e Abdul, insegnava a lui le parole chiave con cui rivolgersi a lei o in inglese, e lui insegnava a lei come ci si parla l'indiano, la lingua indiana parlata dalle persone colte, perché, ripeto, lui non nasceva come cameriere. Infatti poi a un certo punto si lamentò di questa sua posizione. quando in un certo senso, ma è umano, capì che la regina in un certo qual modo lo favoriva, lo aiutava, gli regalò anche dei terreni per costruirsi una casa. Era quello che si diceva con un termine assolutamente improprio, un favorito, ma era un favorito perché in questo modo si favoriva il legame tra l'Inghilterra e l'India. Quindi il ruolo di quest'uomo è un ruolo importantissimo, perché è la persona che stava più vicina, forse in un certo qual modo affettivamente, in un certo qual modo più vicino che il suo stesso figlio, che poi fu il suo successore, Edoardo VII, con cui Vittoria aveva sì un ottimo rapporto, ma siccome era più un rapporto da regina col primo dei suoi sudditi che come rapporto che una madre ha col suo figlio maschio primogenito. Con Abdul non c'era questo rapporto, non c'era un rapporto così, diciamolo così, dinastico, come poteva avere la regina Vittoria col figlio maschio primogenito, in realtà era il secondogenito, perché la prima era una figlia, Vicky. Non c'era un rapporto così confidenziale, assolutamente. Era un rapporto molto formale. E in realtà il principe di Galles, Edoardo, un po' forse travisò questa relazione, non aveva capito che questo rapporto non era un rapporto tra due persone, ma era un incontro, ed è importantissimo, non mi stancherò mai di ripetere, è importantissimo. Questo rapporto era l'incontro di due culture. Lui insegnava a lei quanto era antica, quanto era bella, quanto era importante la cultura, la letteratura, l'arte dell'India. Un continente intero. Quindi in poche parole, in pochi anni, si instaurò un rapporto così confidenziale per cui lei chiedeva continuamente informazioni, gli chiedeva aiuto se doveva ricevere come ripeto, se doveva ricevere dei dignitari indiani, delle persone di alto rango, in che modo ci si doveva rivolgere. Perché in Inghilterra in realtà insomma, l'acquisizione dell'India da parte dell'Inghilterra datava da un decennio. Per cui sì, c'erano stati naturalmente anche prima le due culture si erano già, diciamo così, conosciute, però questo rapporto così personale, così dinastico, perché la regina Vittoria fu dichiarata negli anni 70 dell'Ottocento imperatrice delle Indie, per cui so che nella famiglia di madre Giulia non c'era questo, diciamo così, rapporto, eravate più, i tuoi antenati erano più non erano di stampo colonialista, diciamo così, erano più, me lo raccontavi ieri, però l'incontro tra queste due culture è stato veramente importante. È inutile negarlo, l'incontro tra queste due persone è stato importantissimo. E di questo abbiamo in realtà un riflesso anche nella nostra Firenze, perché sappiamo che Abdul seguì la regina Vittoria nelle sue 3 visite a Firenze, a Villa Palmieri e a Villa Fabbricotti. Ci restano anche pochissime tracce, però ci sono, di questo stile che io non chiamerei coloniale, chiamerei anglo-indiano della seconda metà dell'Ottocento. L'esempio più bello, poi voi per fortuna vostra, io purtroppo non ci potrei essere, andrete a visitare il monumento del principe indiano alle Cascine. Questo monumento al principe indiano è il simbolo della cultura anglo-indiana, perché si tratta di un giovane principe indiano che in viaggio per tornare in India alloggiò a quello che è l'attuale Hotel St. Regis in Piazza Ognissanti, che allora si chiamava Hotel della Pace, si ammalò e morì. La religione indiana prescriveva che si doveva, e fu, devo dire, per merito di Ubaldino Peruzzi, che tutto ciò poteva avvenire, perché non si potevano celebrare riti di questo genere in Italia nel 1800, negli anni 90, mi pare, 70 dell'Ottocento, non si potevano celebrare questo genere di riti se non c'era un permesso dell'autorità civica. Ubaldino Peruzzi permise che questa sepoltura fosse fatta secondo i riti della religione. Si prescriveva che dovesse essere seppellito alla confluenza di due fiumi e si trovò tutto questo in fondo al parco, già parco delle Cascine voluto da Pietro Leopoldo d'Asburgo-Lorena nell'ultima metà del XVIII secolo, quindi era già parco quando il principe indiano morì. Devo dire, se qui voglio proprio veramente entrare nel personale, che il monumento al principe indiano è uno dei monumenti che io amo di più a Firenze. E a Firenze i monumenti, insomma, basta guardarsi intorno anche qui. Firenze, anche qui, in questa stessa sala, anche solo qui, ovunque ti giri c'è qualcosa che ti richiama alla storia dell'arte. Il monumento del principe indiano, insieme alla fontana che è stata recentemente restaurata, sono un simbolo di questa cultura anglo-indiana che iniziò appunto a svilupparsi nella seconda metà del XIX secolo, dopo che la regina Vittoria fu proclamata imperatrice delle Indie. Naturalmente in India e in Inghilterra questo genere di monumenti, questo genere di cultura è molto più sviluppata. Qui abbiamo, credo, come unico esempio, non credo che ci sia altro che la fontana della regina Vittoria all'entrata delle Cascine. È molto bello anche come sono stati messi, perché quello del principe indiano è lì e lì rimane, è sempre stato, sempre sarà. La fontana della regina Vittoria, recentemente restaurata, è messa all'entrata delle Cascine, del parco delle Cascine. E forse, in un certo senso, sarebbe meglio metterla proprio dentro il parco delle Cascine. Sarebbe più logico metterla proprio dentro, all'entrata, ma dentro il parco delle Cascine. Però, ringraziamo il cielo, è stata restaurata e soprattutto ringraziamo il cielo che la restauratrice del monumento qui presente, che vogliamo ringraziare, la dottoressa Anelli, che ha restaurato così sapientemente il monumento al principe indiano, ci ha restituito, perché prima era ridotto proprio maluccio, devo dire la verità, ci ha restituito una memoria anche affettiva, soprattutto affettiva, oltre che artistica, perché dovete sapere, come sapete, che tra gli inglesi che sono sempre venuti a Firenze, io ho testimonianze, la prima rappresentanza diplomatica inglese al mondo era con i medici, già nel 400. Quindi la prima rappresentanza diplomatica inglese al mondo è con Firenze, con la Repubblica e poi con la Signoria di Firenze. Questo amore, questa unione, questa corrispondenza, come credo direbbe Dante, di amorosi sensi, col monumento al principe indiano ha la sua massima esaltazione. Quindi quando andrete, fra poco, il tempo forse non sarà dei migliori, però potete con l'aiuto e con la guida della dottoressa e di Madre Giulia ammirare questo monumento e guardandolo bene capirete come era stretto il rapporto tra la regina e l'arte e la cultura indiana. Quindi quel rapporto che è stato travisato tra la regina d'Inghilterra e il suo servitore, che poi aumentò di rango e non si limitò a essere un semplice cameriere, ma fu dichiarato addirittura, sembra quasi che l'avessero voluto, c'era una volontà di dargli quasi un titolo che lo equiparava a un pari d'Inghilterra. Naturalmente tutta la corte, insomma, si rifiutò, la regina comunque era la regina democratica, doveva sottomettersi anche al volere del governo e quindi non gli fu dato un titolo equiparabile a quello di pari d'Inghilterra, ma naturalmente un titolo lo ebbe. Nel 1901, alla morte, gennaio del 1901, alla morte della regina Vittoria, il successore Edoardo VII, che aveva un po' di gelosia forse nei confronti del servitore della madre, lo trattò con i dovuti riguardi, lo rimandò in India con la famiglia, aveva come usanza della sua religione, aveva 2 mogli e non aveva figli. E lo rimandò in India, dove nel 1905 il figlio e successore, il futuro Giorgio V, re d'Inghilterra, durante una visita in India, lo incontrò e scrisse al padre: ho visto il Mushi, è ancora un po' ingrassato, ma non dà nessun tipo di problema. Non pubblicava lettere, non aveva ricevuto particolari regali, viveva una vita tranquilla, serena, naturalmente senza problemi economici, ma assolutamente tranquilla. Tutto ciò sta a dimostrare, qui concludo, ringraziando tutti voi, specialmente Madre Giulia, di essere qui con noi, di avermi fatto essere con voi oggi. Concludo che quest'uomo, che non ebbe particolari privilegi e non ebbe particolari favori, era semplicemente un tramite dell'incontro tra la cultura anglosassone e la cultura indiana, che ha portato evidentemente dei buoni frutti. Grazie.
Grazie. Ora Gabriele
Allora, questo funziona oppure no?
No, se
No,
lei parla in
no,
sala,
allora cerco di parlare forte. Sì.
perfetto.
Allora, vi posso chiedere vi posso chiedere di posso cominciare? Vi posso chiedere di me prendere posto? Cosa ho fatto io? Avete tutti, credo, ricevuto uno handout dove c'è anche l'abstract, dove quindi vedete che questa opera di Lytton Strachey sarà esaminata dal punto di vista dell'imperialismo, come veniva recepito nel periodo vittoriano ed edoardiano, e naturalmente come la regina Vittoria, no, non c'è questo, non c'è, non funziona. No. Non si sente? Si sente. E come la regina Vittoria venne a rappresentare, diciamo, l'emblema dell'impero britannico. Allora, come introduzione, posso parlare? Giulia?
Sì, continua. Sì.
Allora, come introduzione, alla fine dell'Ottocento motivi economici, politici e religiosi mossero le nazioni europee a espandere la loro influenza su altre regioni, ciascuna nell'intento di accrescere il proprio potere. L'impero britannico si estese al di là del mare perché la rivoluzione industriale dell'Ottocento aveva creato il bisogno di risorse naturali necessarie a far funzionare i macchinari e i mezzi di trasporto appena inventati. In questo periodo l'India, l'India che era già sotto il controllo della corona dal 1858, acquisì status imperiale nell'intento di collegarla più strettamente al suo centro metropolitano, cioè Londra. Un atto parlamentare riguardante i titoli reali, Royal Titles Bill, fu presentato in Parlamento nel 1876 e nel 1877 Benjamin Disraeli, primo ministro conservatore, fece proclamare la regina Vittoria imperatrice dell'India. La regina Vittoria in questa occasione aprì il Parlamento in persona per la prima volta dopo la morte del principe Alberto per annunciare il cambio di titolo reale. In questa occasione a Delhi, nella Delhi Zambar, la corte di Delhi, naturalmente, il 1° gennaio 1887 si tennero fastose celebrazioni sotto la guida del viceré Lord Lytton. A Delhi, questo evento, ecco, inaugurò il periodo cosiddetto del nuovo imperialismo in Gran Bretagna, ideologia che fu disseminata tramite un gran numero di agenzie propagandistiche imperiali fondate nel tardo Ottocento e ai primi del Novecento. Queste agenzie diffondevano una visione del mondo in buona parte basata su un rinnovato militarismo, la devozione verso la legalità, l'identificazione con e la venerazione di eroi nazionali e anche il culto della personalità e, ultimo, ma certamente forse la cosa più importante, idee razziali associate con il darwinismo sociale.
Come osserva Mackenzie, uno studioso appunto di queste l'influenza di queste idee sulla cultura popolare fu prodotta in quanto fu profonda, in quanto esse penetrarono nel sistema educativo, nelle forze armate, nei movimenti giovanili in uniforme, come i Boy Scouts, nelle chiese e nelle società missionarie ed anche perfino in forme di intrattenimento pubblico come il music hall e le esposizioni. Ecco, detto questo, quindi fu molto popolare, queste idee divennero, questa forma di imperialismo divenne molto popolare, ma neppure l'intelligenza fu immune dalle idee dell'imperialismo. Forse il più famoso scrittore che contribuì a diffondere l'idea della superiorità della civiltà bianca è Kipling, che si fece interprete, propagandista e principale apologeta dell'elite imperialista. Un punto di vista meno smaccatamente darwiniano è quello di Lytton Strachey, intellettuale membro del gruppo di Bloomsbury, il quale inaugurò un nuovo tipo di biografia che ebbe molto successo con la sua opera Vittoriani Eminenti, Eminent Victorians, del 18. Ecco, dopo questo successo lui scrisse la biografia della regina Vittoria, quindi Victoria, che è del 1921. Ecco, la regina Vittoria, diciamo ora qualcosa, ecco. Come indicato da Mackenzie, voi avete nell'handout, c'è la bibliografia, Mackenzie, vedete quello che ha studiato proprio il flusso di queste idee della propaganda imperialista. Ecco, come indicato da Mackenzie, la venerazione della monarchia si sviluppò dalla fine degli anni 70 dell'Ottocento e quando ciò avvenne lo fu in stretta unione con il ruolo imperiale del monarca. La biografia della regina Vittoria di Strachey contribuì a stabilizzare il ruolo del monarca come emblema imperiale. Infatti, Strachey presenta Vittoria come matriarca regale, dal momento che questa considerava i sudditi imperiali come la sua famiglia allargata. Ecco, inoltre la biografia mostra il particolare attaccamento all'India, come abbiamo sentito nella precedente comunicazione, il particolare attaccamento che Vittoria aveva per l'India. La regina Vittoria era infatti affascinata dall'India, come scrive una Lejeune, una che avete in bibliografia, una studiosa francese, in tutta la sua vita, ecco, qui cito in traduzione mia, in tutta la sua vita la monarca fu molto attiva nello scoprire l'India, cercava di entrare in contatto con il suo, virgolette, popolo indiano, del cui benessere si interessava regolarmente. Era curiosa di ascoltare e leggere le testimonianze e le storie personali di ufficiali inglesi o viaggiatori tornati di recente dall'India. Divenne appassionata degli indiani, particolarmente di coloro che poteva incontrare in Inghilterra. Collezionava oggetti, dipinti e schizzi che evocavano scene di vita del subcontinente indiano. Più anziana, cercò di riprodurre il mondo orientale intorno a lei, a Osborne House. Nel suo Rai, i territori della corona in India, che avevano questo nome, cercò di difendere i nativi dell'India dal duro dominio imperiale dei suoi ministri per affezione materna. Ecco, Vittoria prendeva i suoi doveri di imperatrice con molta serietà e quando arrivò il momento del suo giubileo nel 1887 fece ogni sforzo per mettere in risalto, virgolette, il gioiello dell'impero britannico, come lei chiamava il Rai. Offrì banchetti sontuosi non solo alla nobiltà europea, ma anche ai principi indiani e partecipò a elaborate processioni a cavallo scortata dalla cavalleria coloniale indiana. Aggiunse anche inservienti indiani alla famiglia reale per aiutare nei festeggiamenti. Vittoria sviluppò una particolare simpatia, come abbiamo già sentito, per uno dei suoi nuovi servitori, Abdul Karim. Ben presto il ruolo di questi cambiò dal servire al tavolo all'insegnare alla regina a leggere, scrivere e parlare in urdu o hindustani. La regina voleva conoscere tutto dell'India, un paese sul quale dominava ma che non poté mai visitare. Abdul le raccontò tutto di Agra, dai frutti e le spezie locali ai panorami e ai suoni della sua patria. In breve, egli divenne il suo monshi o insegnante e si iniziò un'amicizia, come abbiamo già sentito, che sarebbe durata per oltre un decade. Ecco, veniamo ora all'opera di Strachey, la biografia della regina Vittoria. Nella sua biografia, la regina Vittoria, nella sua biografia della regina Vittoria, Strachey si focalizza solo su uno dei 3 elementi della propaganda imperialista individuati da Mackenzie, che abbiamo già citato. Dopo che Vittoria fu proclamata imperatrice dell'India, Strachey mostra come la monarchia sia collegata all'imperialismo e come Vittoria incarni in modo particolarmente appropriato l'impero, diventi l'emblema dell'impero. Ecco, avete qui una prima citazione da questa biografia che vi leggo, ma insomma avete anche lì. Ecco, dove si vede proprio il valore, il misticismo che viene attribuito alla monarchia. Ecco, naturalmente, scrive Strachey, naturalmente tutto il misticismo della Costituzione inglese si concentrava nella corona, con la sua venerabile antichità, con le sue sacre rimembranze, le sue cerimonie imponenti e spettacolose. Ma per quasi 2 secoli il buonsenso aveva predominato nel grande edificio e il piccolo cantuccio inesplorato e inesplicabile aveva attratto ben poca attenzione. Ecco, questo è naturalmente un mio commento, fra parentesi, perché l'imperialismo non è soltanto una questione d'affari, ma è anche una questione di fede. E col suo crescere crebbe anche il lato mistico della vita pubblica inglese e simultaneamente una nuova importanza cominciò ad essere attribuita alla corona. Il bisogno di un simbolo della potenza inglese, del valore inglese, dello straordinario e misterioso destino dell'Inghilterra cominciò a essere sentito più forte che mai. Quel simbolo era rappresentato dalla corona e la corona posava sul capo di Vittoria. Così avvenne che, mentre al termine del regno il potere della sovrana era sensibilmente diminuito, il prestigio della sovrana invece era enormemente accresciuto. Ecco, i britannici certamente concepivano il loro impero gerarchicamente in termini razzisti di superiorità e inferiorità, centro e periferia. Ma come indicato da un altro studioso, Canadine, di cui avete in bibliografia l'indicazione, oltre alla considerazione dell'India basata sulle differenze, la percepivano anche come un territorio coloniale dotato di somiglianze. Vedevano le altre popolazioni composte di individui che si potevano comparare sulla base di una somiglianza di status. Questo portò al riconoscimento di status sociali uguali. I principi sono principi da tutte le parti. E formò la base dell'estremamente elaborato territorio coloniale dell'India. Questo aspetto è presente anche nella biografia di Strachey, nel quale Vittoria è presentata come una matriarca che governa il suo popolo, sia britannico sia coloniale. Ciò è solennemente ricordato da Strachey in occasione del Giubileo, che legittimò lo status imperiale nella relazione che univa la corona ai principi governanti del subcontinente indiano, ora integrati nei principi aristocratici britannici. Quindi non c'è solo la differenza, ci sono anche queste come dire, somiglianze che voi sapete l'Inghilterra è insomma, come si dice sempre, gli Stati Uniti le differenze sono basate sulla razza e in Gran Bretagna sono basate sul ceto sociale, in un certo senso. Insomma, Allora, ecco, allora qui avete un'altra citazione che illustra questo che ho detto ora. Ecco, qui si parla della, come si dice, di questo giubileo. Ecco, l'anno seguente era il 50° del suo regno e nel giugno lo splendido anniversario fu celebrato con pompa solenne. Vittoria, circondata dai supremi dignitari del regno, scortata da uno scintillante corteo di re e di principi, passò attraverso la folla entusiasta della capitale per recarsi a ringraziare Dio nell'abbazia di Westminster. In quell'ora di trionfo le ultime tracce residue delle vecchie antipatie e delle vecchie discordie furono interamente cancellate. La regina fu salutata a un tempo come la madre del suo popolo e come il simbolo incarnato della grandezza imperiale d'Inghilterra. Ed ella corrispose a questo duplice sentimento con tutto l'ardore del suo spirito. Ella sapeva, ella sentiva che l'Inghilterra e il suo popolo erano, per un prodigio meraviglioso e tuttavia semplicissimo, cosa sua. Esultanza, affetto, gratitudine, un senso profondo di riconoscenza, un orgoglio senza limiti, tali erano i suoi sentimenti, ma sopra di essi vi era qualche altra cosa che dava colore e intensità a tutto il resto. Finalmente, dopo tanto tempo, la felicità, per quanto frammentaria e carica di gravità, ma tuttavia vera e indiconoscibile felicità, era ritornata a lei. Questo insolito sentimento riempiva e accendeva tutta la sua coscienza, quando, ritornata a Buckingham Palace dopo la fine della lunga cerimonia, le fu chiesto come si sentiva. Sono molto stanca, ma anche molto felice, rispose. Ecco, Stretch mostra anche la crescita del ruolo cerimoniale dell'imperatrice. Con considerevole pompa si tennero esibizioni indiane e coloniali inaugurate da Vittoria. La regina Vittoria divenne il perno del nuovo imperialismo, percepito in Gran Bretagna come un periodo di sicurezza e prosperità. Per le celebrazioni del 1887 e 1897 vennero a Londra primi ministri coloniali e principi indiani, accompagnati da truppe e seguaci esotici e pieni di colori. Così Stretch descrive il giorno che segue il giubileo. Così, dopo i travagli e le tempeste della giornata, sopravvenne un lungo crepuscolo dolce e sereno e illuminato dai raggi dorati della gloria, perché un'atmosfera senza esempio di trionfo e di adorazione avvolse l'ultimo periodo della vita di Vittoria. Il suo trionfo era la sintesi e l'emblema di un più grande trionfo, della culminante prosperità della nazione. Il consistente splendore del decennio, 87-97, che trascorse tra i due giubilei di Vittoria, trova assente uguale negli annali dell'Inghilterra. I saggi consigli di Lord Salisbury parvero portare con sé non soltanto la ricchezza e la potenza, ma anche la sicurezza, e il paese si assise con sicura tranquillità al godimento di una grandezza ben stabilita. Come era naturale, anche Vittoria si assise, perché ella era una parte dell'edificio, una parte che appariva essenziale, come un mobile. Ecco, questo è carino, questo, come un mobile, una magnifica e inamovibile vetrina nel vasto salone dello Stato. Senza di lei il copioso festino del 1890 avrebbe perduto la sua qualità più singolare. La serie così bene ordinata di sostanziosi e semplici piatti, con il riflesso pesante sulle pareti dell'argenteria quasi nascosta agli sguardi. Ecco, veniamo ora a qualche conclusione, insomma, a qualche osservazione conclusiva. Allora, il punto centrale della biografia della regina Vittoria di Strachey è la sua trasformazione da vedova petulante a matriarca imperiale. Il ruolo mondiale di imperatrice fu per lei fonte di eccitazione nella sua vecchiaia e conferì nuovo significato al cerimoniale che la circondava. Sebbene i toni più aspramente darwiniani dell'ideologia imperialista siano assenti in questo lavoro di Strachey, la luce favorevole gettata sulla qualità mistica dell'impero britannico e su Vittoria, lei stessa, una Tory imperialista non da meno dei suoi ministri, mostra chiaramente che la biografia di Strachey è opera di propaganda a favore della mentalità coloniale così diffusa nella Gran Bretagna vittoriana ed eudaliana in tutte le classi sociali e che, dice il già citato Mackenzie, inaugurò un periodo che sarebbe durato fino all'ascesa al trono di Elisabetta II, nel quale tutti i grandi eventi reali sarebbero stati imperiali. Ecco, bene, grazie.
Allora, domani abbiamo ora parlato 2 ore non era facile perché ma c'è e guardiamo, wanted to not being able to join in. Okay, right. Abbiamo comunicazioni. Mi scusi voi? Sì. Allora, unmute tutti.
Sì, sì.
Sì, per... sì. Ci sono domande? Are there questions? Niente? Si può, forse io sono ancora, no?
No, no.
Ok, poi mi senti? Sì.
Sì, sì.
Ok.
No, non c'è là, è attivato, quello è il computer. Qui
Sì,
si sente.
sì. Ok. Allora, se domandiamo se non ci sono ricordi, quanti di voi andremo con noi al monumento? Vediamo. C'è il programma. Sì. Un grande. L'ho fatto. Oh.
Julia, are we having a break now? Are we moving on to lunch?
Yeah.
Okay.
So Julia, if you want to say.
Okay.
Sì.
There's a problem with it.
Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, we seem to have had a problem. We're going to be going for lunch at the Monument for the Prince, and we'll be coming back at our time, 2:30. 14:30 va bene. 14:30. And ringrazio tanto per tutta la partecipazione. We thank all of you for your participation. And I hope it was intelligible. I found the way the subjects interacted with each other fascinating. Ruskin, India, Florence and England. So we'll see you again, and we're going to shut down pausa for lunch, and then we will be back.